The scent of stale sweat, cheap wine, and the metallic tang of blood is the permanent atmosphere of the Lentulus Batiatus gladiatorial school in Capua. In the midsummer of 73 B.C., this ludus is not a place of sport, but a high-security storage facility for human weapons. 78 men, primarily Thracians and Gauls, move with a synchronization that no Roman militia can replicate. They do not have access to the armory yet. Their uprising begins in the most mundane and brutal of places, the kitchen. They seize meat cleavers, heavy iron spits, and long carving knives. Spartacus, a man of immense physical presence with a background in auxiliary military service, does not lead a riot. He executes a tactical breach. The first guards fall not to disciplined sword strikes, but to the raw, kinetic violence of heavy iron spits driven through unarmored throats. The sound of the breakout is the rhythmic thud of wooden doors being splintered and the wet, sliding scrape of iron against bone. Tell us where you're watching from. What time is it for you? The iron grip of Rome is about to be tested by the very men it trained to die for entertainment. This is the fundamental paradox of the Roman entertainment industry. They have spent decades perfecting the physical lethality of men who have every reason to hate the state. These gladiators are elite athletes, their muscles dense from years of repetitive training against the paulus, their pain thresholds pushed beyond the limits of a normal soldier. As they surge through the gates of the ludus, they encounter a stroke of logistical fortune, a transport wagon loaded with gladiatorial armor and weapons destined for another city. They do not hesitate. They cast aside the kitchen knives and don the heavy bronze greaves and the murmillo helmets with their restrictive, crossbarred visors. They seize the scutum, the heavy rectangular shield, and the thraex's curved sicca. The transformation from livestock to an insurgent cell is instantaneous and absolute. They move south, bypassing the urban centers, toward the jagged slopes of Mount Vesuvius. This is a deliberate choice of defensive geography. Vesuvius at this time is not a conical peak, but a plateaued fortress, its summit a natural citadel covered in dense, wild vegetation. Spartacus understands the mechanics of Roman pursuit. He knows that the local magistrates will first send the vigiles and urban militias, men who are essentially glorified night watchmen. By the time they reach the mountain, the rebels have already established a perimeter. They begin the physical process of turning a volcano into a military base. They raid the surrounding latifundia, the massive agricultural estates that power the Roman economy. They do not pillage for gold, they pillage for utility. They seize grain shipments, horses for scouting, and most importantly, iron tools. The sound of the mountain changes. The silence of the wilderness is replaced by the rhythmic clanging of hammers as they reforge agricultural scythes into spearheads. The Roman military machine, designed for the grand symmetrical warfare of the Mediterranean, finds itself facing an internal virus it was never built to fight. The legions are far away, engaged in the Mithridatic Wars in the east and the Sertorian Rebellion in Spain. In the vacuum left by the professional military, the Capuan breakout creates a gravitational pull for the dispossessed. Every runaway slave who reaches the slopes is integrated into a growing hierarchy. They are stripped of their civilian identity and folded into a proto-military structure. They are taught the basics of the thrust and parry, the economy of movement required to kill a man in a single strike. The heat of the Campanian sun bakes the volcanic soil as thousands of feet trample the vineyards, creating a barren zone of control around the mountain. The rebels are no longer just fugitives. They are an occupying force in the heart of Italy's most fertile province. The logistics of the rebel camp are brutal. Water must be hauled up the steep cliffs. Food is rationed based on combat utility. Spartacus enforces a discipline that mirrors the very legions he intends to fight. He knows that a mob will be slaughtered, but an army might survive. The visual reality of the camp is one of constant motion, men sharpening blades with whetstones, weaving baskets for storage, and training in the dust of the plateau. The smell of wood smoke and roasting livestock drifts down into the valleys, a constant sensory reminder to the Roman elite that their property has become their predator. The Order of Rome, which relies on the psychological submission of millions, is physically being dismantled at the base of the volcano. The breakout at Capua was the spark, The isolation of Vesuvius is the incubation period for a war that will threaten the very foundations of the Republic. In the marble halls of the Senate, the news of the Vesuvius encampment is treated with a mixture of annoyance and condescension. To the Roman elite, a slave revolt is a matter of civil policing, not a military crisis. They dispatched the praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber with a force of 3,000 men. This is not a legion of veterans. It is a tumultuarius, a force raised in haste from the local populace. These men are shopkeepers, farmers, and urban laborers who have been handed a pilum and told to suppress a rabble. Glaber's tactical approach is rooted in arrogance. He arrives at the base of Vesuvius and, seeing the sheer cliffs and the single, narrow path leading to the summit, decides against a direct assault. He opts for a siege of attrition. He blocks the only known entrance, intending to sit in the shade of his tents while hunger and thirst do the work for him. This is his first and fatal mechanical error. Glaber establishes his camp with the standard Roman palisade and ditch, but the construction is sloppy. The ditch is shallow, and the watchtowers are undermanned. The soldiers spend their time in idle chatter, convinced that the gladiators will eventually crawl down the path, begging for mercy. They do not understand the physical conditioning of their enemy. On the summit, the situation is indeed dire. The sun radiates off the black basalt, and the water barrels are empty. However, the rebels have spent their lives adapting to the physical constraints of the ludus. They do not look for mercy, they look for leverage. Spartacus and his lieutenants, Crixus and Enemaus, observe the Roman lines from the heights. They note the laxity of the sentries and the positioning of the Roman baggage train. They recognize that the impassable cliffs are only impassable to men who fear death more than failure. The rebels begin a massive engineering project using the only abundant resource on the mountain, the wild vines. These are not the delicate vines of a manicured vineyard, but thick, fibrous stalks of wild grape, tough enough to sustain the weight of an armored man. Under the cover of a moonless night, the rebels weave these vines into long, sturdy ladders and ropes. This is a feat of improvised logistics that requires thousands of man-hours. The sound of the work is a low, constant rustle of vegetation being stripped and braided. Once the ladders are complete, the descent begins. It is a vertical drop of hundreds of feet down the sheer, jagged face of the mountain. One by one, the gladiators slide down the ropes, their calloused hands gripping the rough bark, the smell of crushed green wood and ozone filling the air. The physical toll of this maneuver is immense. The men must descend in full gear, carrying their shields and swords tied to their backs. A single slip means a silent death on the rocks below. Yet, they reach the bottom without alerting a single Roman sentry. They do not flee into the night. Instead, they wheel around the base of the mountain, moving through the dense brush with the predatory silence they learned in the arena. The Roman camp is oriented entirely toward the mountain path. They have built their defenses facing a ghost. The rebels, now positioned at the rear of the Roman camp, wait for the pre-dawn mist to settle. The air is cold and damp, a sharp contrast to the heat of the summit. The assault is an explosion of kinetic energy. The rebels do not use the slow, rhythmic advance of the Roman line. They hit the camp like a physical shockwave. They surge over the low palisades, their blades finding the throats of men still wrapped in their sleeping furs. The sound of the battle is a chaotic mix of panicked shouts, the heavy thud of shields smashing into tent poles, and the wet, repetitive sound of iron slicing through flesh. Glaber's militia collapses. Without the structure of their formation, they are nothing more than individuals facing professional killers. Glaber is forced to abandon his camp, his insignia, and his dignity, fleeing into the darkness. The rebels now possess the entire Roman baggage train, thousands of suits of armor, piles of grain, and the refined weapons of the Republic. This slave rabble has not only survived, they have equipped themselves with the very tools meant for their destruction. To understand the lethality of the rebel corps, one must analyze the industrial mechanics of the ludus, the gladiatorial school. These were not mere prisons. They were high-performance training centers designed to produce the most efficient killing machines in the ancient world. A gladiator represented a massive capital investment for a lanista like Lentulus Batiatus. Their bodies were treated as biological assets. Their diet was scientifically managed, consisting of a high-carbohydrate regimen of barley and legumes, often called gladiator mush, to create a thick layer of subcutaneous fat. This fat served a purely defensive, mechanical purpose. It allowed for deep, superficial cuts to bleed profusely for the crowd's entertainment without damaging the underlying muscle tissue or vital organs. The rebels under Spartacus are thick-muscled, heavy-set men with high pain thresholds and cardiovascular systems hardened by years of anaerobic stress. Training in the ludus was a relentless cycle of kinetic repetition. The central tool was the paulus, a heavy wooden stake driven into the ground. A gladiator would strike this post thousands of times a day with a rudis, a wooden training sword that was intentionally weighted to be twice as heavy as a standard steel gladius. This mechanical overloading built the explosive forearm, shoulder, and core strength necessary to punch through bronze breastplates and shatter wooden shields. When the revolt began, these men did not need to be taught how to fight. They only needed to be organized. Spartacus took the individualistic, high-stakes skill of the duelist and grafted it onto the structural skeleton of the Roman maniple. He transformed a collection of performers into a meat-grinding machine. The weaponry of the rebels in these early stages is a chaotic assemblage of stolen Roman kits and specialized arena gear. The Myrmillo's helmet is a massive bronze construct, featuring a distinctive fish crest and a heavy, graded faceplate that offers superior protection but limits visibility to a narrow, claustrophobic grid and restricts oxygen intake. The Thraex's Sicca, a short sword with a blade that curves forward, is a mechanical marvel of geometry. It is designed specifically to reach around the edge of a rectangular shield to sever the femoral artery or the Achilles tendon of an opponent's lead leg. In the hands of a runaway slave, these tools are used with a specific, visceral efficiency. There is no flourish here, only the calculated application of force to the weakest points of the human frame. Spartacus organizes his forces into cohorts, mimicking the Roman style because it is the most effective way to move large bodies of men through the Italian landscape. However, he faces a massive deficit in heavy infantry equipment. To solve this, the rebels establish a mobile industrial complex. They do not have permanent forges, so they utilize portable bellows and charcoal pits. They melt down the iron shackles of newly liberated slaves, the very symbols of their bondage, and reforge them into spearheads and sword blades. They use the hides of slaughtered cattle, stretched over wicker frames and hardened with layers of boiled glue and resin, to create makeshift shields. The smell of burning charcoal, hot iron, and curing leather follows the rebel column like a dark cloud. This is the industrialization of an insurgency. They are a mobile city of blacksmiths and butchers, refining their lethality with every passing mile. The tactical brilliance displayed at Vesuvius remains one of the most unorthodox maneuvers in ancient military history, a triumph of improvised engineering over static defense. After the initial breakout and the defeat of Gladiator, the Roman Senate realized that a more methodical approach was required. They dispatched the praetor Publius Varinius. Unlike his predecessor, Varinius attempted to utilize the Roman specialty, engineering and containment. He split his forces to surround the base of the volcano, building more permanent fortifications. The Roman engineers, masters of the shovel and the pick, began to move thousands of tons of earth to create a munitio, a fortified line intended to starve the rebels. The sound of wood being felled for palisades and the rhythmic thud of earth being packed created a constant, daunting background noise for the rebels trapped above. Spartacus, observing from the heights, understood the physics of the siege. A Roman defense is a wall. A wall is only as strong as its foundation and the attention of its guards. The Roman strategy was based on the assumption that the rebels were bound by the same biological limits as their own troops, that they would eventually be broken by the lack of fresh water and the caloric deficit of the heights. The decision to use the wild vines of the mountain was not an act of desperation, but a calculated vertical flanking maneuver. These vines, the Vitis sylvestris, were thick, ropey, and incredibly strong. The rebels spent days stripping the bark and braiding the fibers into heavy-duty cables. They tested these cables against the weight of several men, ensuring the tensile strength was sufficient for a full-scale descent. The descent itself was a grueling test of grip strength and raw nerve. In the absolute darkness of a moonless night, the men had to lower themselves down a sheer basalt cliff face that dropped hundreds of feet into the abyss. They could not use torches. They had to rely on the tactile feedback of the vine ropes and the scrape of their sandals against the cold rock. One by one, the gladiators and their recruits slid down, the friction of the ropes searing their palms and the smell of ozone and crushed vegetation filling the air. This was a movement of thousands of pounds of human muscle and iron, executed with the silence of a hunting pack. Once on the ground, they did not flee, they reorganized. The subsequent assault on the Roman camp was a masterpiece of kinetic shock. The Roman fortifications were oriented entirely toward the only known path down the mountain. Their rear was exposed, protected only by the impassable cliffs. The rebels hit the camp like a physical hammer. The sound of the engagement was a chaotic symphony of clashing bronze, the splintering of wooden tent poles, and the guttural roars of men who had been treated like animals now acting as executioners. The Roman defense, predicated on a frontal assault, shattered instantly. Verinius was forced to flee on a horse seized from his own stables, leaving behind his lictors, the men who carried the fasces, the bundles of rods and axes that symbolized the absolute power of Rome. By seizing these, Spartacus didn't just take weapons. He took the physical manifestations of Roman law. The fire from the burning Roman tents lit the valley, a signal to every slave in Campania that the impassable had been conquered. Following the victory at Vesuvius, the rebel army underwent a massive demographic and logistical transformation. They moved through the Italian countryside like a tectonic plate, shifting the social landscape. They targeted the latifundia, the massive, slave-run agricultural factories owned by the Roman senatorial class. These estates were the fuel tanks of the Republic, manned by thousands of captives from Gaul, Germania, Thrace, and the East. When Spartacus smashed the gates of these estates, he didn't just liberate workers, he recruited specialized labor. The rebel army swelled from a few thousand to tens of thousands in a matter of months. This was no longer a band of fugitives. It was a mobile nation of the dispossessed, numbering nearly 70,000 at its peak. The influx of rural laborers brought immense logistical challenges. These men were often malnourished, their bodies scarred by the whip and the heavy labor of the fields. Spartacus and his officers, including the formidable Crixus, established a rigorous, industrial-scale training program. They converted captured villas into temporary barracks and parade grounds. The sounds of the Italian countryside, the lowing of cattle and the rustle of wheat, were replaced by the rhythmic shouting of men practicing the thrust and twist of the gladius. They did not have enough Roman swords, so they set up massive, outdoor manufacturing centers. They stripped the iron tires from wagon wheels and the chains from the slave quarters, melting them down in high-heat pits to forge thousands of spearheads and short swords. The physical power of the army was balanced by its internal friction. The rebel force was a volatile mix of ethnicities. The Gauls and Germans tended to gravitate toward Crixus, preferring a more aggressive, pillaging-based strategy. The Thracians and Greeks followed Spartacus, who favored a more disciplined, long-term approach aimed at escaping Italy altogether. This created a dual command structure that was physically apparent in the camp layouts, distinct clusters of tents and languages. To keep this massive engine running, the rebels became masters of scavenging. They seized grain shipments intended for the Roman markets, effectively hijacking the Republic's food supply. They slaughtered tens of thousands of cattle, using the meat to feed the army and the hides to manufacture the thousands of shields, boots, and harnesses required for a force on the move. The burning of the Roman villas served a dual purpose. It destroyed the local infrastructure of the Roman elite and created a scorched earth zone that prevented the Roman militias from foraging. The smoke from these fires could be seen from the hills surrounding Rome itself. The Republic's economy was built on the assumption of a subservient underclass. Spartacus was physically removing that foundation. The rebel army was now a self-sustaining entity. They had their own baggage trains, their own scouts on stolen Roman horses, and their own medical tents where they utilized vinegar and salt to treat the horrific wounds of ancient warfare. They were a counter-Rome, moving through the heart of the empire with a momentum that seemed, for a time, unstoppable. By 72 B.C., The Roman Republic was a giant struggling under the weight of its own expansion. It was a state designed for war, but it was currently overextended on three fronts. To the west, Pompey the Great was bogged down in a grueling war against the rebel general Sertorius in Spain. To the east, the legions were locked in a costly struggle with Mithridates of Pontus. This left the Italian heartland dangerously underdefended. The recruitment of new legions to face Spartacus was a massive strain on the Republic's grain tribute system. A single Roman legion of 5,000 men required approximately 11 tons of grain every single day, not including the requirements for the thousands of pack animals and cavalry horses. The Senate finally voted to send both standing consuls, Lentulus Clodianus and Gellius Publicola, to deal with the uprising. A consular army is a massive, heavy-moving machine. It consists of the heavy infantry of the legions, the cavalry of the socii, allies, and a vast baggage train of engineers, blacksmiths, and surveyors. The sound of such an army on the march is a deafening, rhythmic roar, the sound of 20,000 iron-shod sandals pounding the paved Roman roads. Each legionary, a Marius's mule, carried nearly 60 pounds of equipment: his larica hamata, chainmail, his scutum, tupila, and his sarcina, a pack containing a digging tool, a cooking pot, and rations for 2 weeks. This equipment was designed for endurance, allowing the legion to move and then immediately build a fortified camp. The Roman military's greatest weapon was not the sword, but the shovel. Their ability to build a castrum, a fortified camp with a 4-foot ditch and a 6-foot palisade, in under 3 hours was the secret to their dominance. It ensured they always fought from a position of strength. However, the geography of Italy worked against this heavy machinery. The Apennines are a rugged, vertical landscape of narrow passes and dense forests. The heavy Roman baggage trains, loaded with siege engines and grain sacks, struggled on the steep, winding mountain paths. Their supply lines became elongated and dangerously vulnerable. Spartacus, utilizing the mobility of his lighter-equipped troops, targeted these supply columns, forcing the legions to march on half rations. Furthermore, the manpower shortage in Rome was acute. To fill the new legions, the Senate was forced to lower its standards, recruiting men who lacked the physical conditioning and gravitas of the veteran troops in Spain. These new recruits were facing gladiators, men who had spent their entire lives in the physical intimacy of killing. When the two forces collided, the psychological pressure on the raw Roman recruits was immense. The sight of a massive, 220-pound Gaulish warrior, shirtless and covered in the blood of a stolen Roman horse, charging with a heavy shield, was often enough to shatter the front rank of a green legion before the first javelin was even thrown. The Roman military machine was physically superior in a pitched battle, but it was being outmaneuvered and outpaced in the vertical reality of the Italian mountains. The year 72 B.C. represented the apex of the rebel success and the nadir of the consular prestige. The two consular armies, under Clodianus and Publicola, moved to trap Spartacus in a grand pincer maneuver. They intended to pin him against the Apennine range. Gellius Publicola moved against a splinter group of 30,000 rebels, mostly Gauls and Germans led by Crixus, who had separated from the main body. Near Mount Garganus, the Roman discipline finally manifested. The Romans utilized the triplex aces, the three-line formation, to grind the less disciplined Germans into the dust. Crixus was killed, and 2/3 of his force were slaughtered. The sound of this battle was a chaotic symphony of clashing bronze and the guttural roars of warriors, ending in the rhythmic thump-thump of Roman shields finishing off the wounded. However, the Roman victory was short-lived. Spartacus, hearing of the defeat of Crixus, did not retreat. He moved with a blistering, predatory speed. He intercepted the army of Lentulus Clodianus in the narrow passes of the Apennines. The terrain here was a mechanical equalizer. The narrow ridges prevented the Romans from deploying their full numerical advantage or their cavalry wings. The rebels occupied the high ground. They utilized the physics of gravity, raining down heavy stones and iron-tipped javelins forged in their mobile smithies. The Roman Aquila, the silver eagle that represented the very soul of the legion, was seen swaying and dipping in the chaos as the standard-bearers were targeted by rebel slings. The humiliation was total. Spartacus collapsed the Roman center by concentrating his best gladiators into a heavy wedge. The Roman heavy infantry, designed to push forward in a wall, found themselves being pushed back into a steep ravine. The sound of the retreat was a cacophony of clattering armor and the screams of men falling into the abyss. After shattering Lentulus, Spartacus turned his entire force back toward the other consul, Gellius, who was still recovering from the battle at Garganus. In a stunning reversal of fortunes, the slave army defeated the Second Consular Army in a matter of days. For the first time in its history, the Republic had seen its highest military authorities defeated in open battle by former property. In a grim act of psychological warfare, Spartacus compelled 300 captured Roman soldiers to fight to the death as gladiators. He held these funeral games in honor of Crixus. This was a physical inversion of the Roman social order. The masters were now the performers, and the slaves were the spectators. The sound of the elite Roman soldiers dying for the entertainment of their former captives resonated through the halls of the Senate. The order of Rome was physically broken in the Italian heartland. The rebels were no longer just a threat. They were the dominant military force in the peninsula. They now possessed a surplus of high-quality Roman equipment, thousands of scuta, pila, and suits of larica hamada. They moved toward the Alps, looking like a Roman army, marching like a Roman army, but fueled by a vengeance that no legion could match. With the consuls disgraced and the Republic in a state of existential panic, the Senate turned to the only man with the resources to stabilize the situation, Marcus Licinius Crassus. Crassus was not a legendary general like Pompey, but he was a master of logistics and a man of cold, industrial violence. He understood that the war against Spartacus was not a matter of heroism, but a matter of management. He utilized his vast personal fortune, built on real estate and silver mines, to fund the raising of 6 new legions, nearly 30,000 men. He did not wait for the slow Roman bureaucracy. He paid for the leather, the grain, the iron, and the wages out of his own coffers. The smell of fresh-tanned leather and the heat of thousands of forges marked his ascent. Crassus diagnosed the Roman failure as a mechanical breakdown of discipline. The legions had lost their fear of their commanders and replaced it with a visceral fear of the gladiators. To rectify this, Crassus reintroduced decimation, the most brutal disciplinary mechanism in the Roman military manual. After 2 of his legions fled the field in a minor engagement, Crassus ordered the survivors to be divided into groups of 10. 1 man from each group was chosen by lot to be bludgeoned or stoned to death by the other 9. The sound of the fustuarium, the rhythmic beating of a soldier by his own comrades, re-established the hierarchy of fear. Crassus made it a physical reality that it was more dangerous to retreat from him than to charge the enemy. The training of Crassus's legions was relentless and grueling. He treated his soldiers like the components of a machine. They were marched 20 miles a day in full combat kit, their feet blistering and then hardening into leather. They were forced to dig and fill trenches for hours on end, not for fortification, but to build the muscle memory of the shovel and the pick. Crassus was not looking for individual bravery. He was looking for a relentless, grinding wall of iron. He perfected his supply lines, ensuring his men were always well fed while the rebels were beginning to starve in the picked-over countryside. He established a network of scouts and spies, tracking the rebel movement with a surveyor's precision. Spartacus was moving south again, toward the toe of Italy, the Bruttium Peninsula. Crassus followed, always a few miles behind, refusing to be drawn into a mountain ambush. He was a patient hunter, waiting for the geography to narrow. The movement of 40,000 legionaries created a permanent scar on the landscape, a wide path of trampled crops, exhausted wells, and the remains of thousands of campfires. Crassus was not interested in the spectacle of the arena. He was interested in the mechanics of the kill. He began to formulate a plan that would utilize Rome's greatest strength, engineering, to trap the rebels against the sea and end the revolt through a massive project of earth and timber. In the winter of 72 to 71 B.C., the rebels reached the southernmost tip of Italy, near the Strait of Messina. They were trapped between the churning waters of the sea and the advancing wall of Crassus's legions. Crassus arrived, and, instead of engaging in a risky pitched battle, he ordered his men to dig. This resulted in the Wall of Crassus, one of the most ambitious and physically imposing engineering feats of the ancient world. The Romans dug a massive ditch across the entire neck of the Bruttium Peninsula, from the Tyrrhenian Sea to the Ionian Sea, a distance of nearly 37 miles. The ditch was 15 feet wide and 15 feet deep. Behind it, they constructed a high stone and timber palisade, reinforced with watchtowers at regular intervals. The physical labor involved was staggering, requiring the movement of millions of cubic feet of earth and the felling of entire forests. The sound of the winter was the constant, rhythmic thrum of thousands of shovels hitting the frozen, rocky soil and the bite of axes into timber. Crassus was literally cutting the rebels off from the rest of the world. He was turning the peninsula into a massive, open-air cage. Inside the lines, the rebel situation deteriorated into a nightmare of biological survival. The winter was exceptionally harsh. The ground was too frozen for foraging, and the grain supplies seized earlier were exhausted. The smell of rotting horse carcasses filled the rebel camp as they were forced to slaughter their mounts for food. Spartacus attempted to negotiate, sending envoys to the Roman lines. Crassus refused to even acknowledge them. In the Roman mechanical view of the world, one does not negotiate with property, one simply fixes the broken system. The rebels attempted several nighttime raids on the wall, but the Roman fortifications were too sound. The legionaries on the battlements rained down a constant stream of arrows and lead-sling bullets. These bullets, called glands, hummed through the air with a deadly, high-pitched whistle before smashing into bone. The engineering of Crassus was doing what the consular armies could not. It was breaking the physical and psychological momentum of the revolt through the sheer weight of earth and timber. The rebels were forced into a state of total desperation. They attempted to build their own improvised siege towers from salvaged wood, but the mud and snow made their movement nearly impossible. Spartacus realized that the only way to survive was a direct, concentrated assault on a single point of the Roman line. Under the cover of a massive blizzard, the rebels filled a section of the 15-foot ditch with the bodies of their dead horses, brushwood, and soil. They charged through the blinding snow, their feet slipping on the gore-slicked bridge they had built. They broke through the line, but at a catastrophic cost. Only a portion of the army escaped. The rest were either cut down in the ditch or remained trapped behind the wall. The engineering of Crassus had successfully bled the rebellion white. The reason Spartacus had moved his army so far south into the toe of Italy was a high-stakes deal brokered with the Cilician pirates. These were the undisputed masters of the Mediterranean, operating from heavily fortified bases in what is now modern-day Turkey. They possessed fleets of swift, maneuverable triremes and a deep-seated hatred for the Roman Republic. The deal was simple. Spartacus would pay the pirates a massive sum in plundered gold and silver, and in exchange, they would provide transport for 2,000 of his most elite fighters to Sicily. Once on the island, Spartacus intended to ignite the dormant fires of the Servile Wars that had devastated Sicily decades earlier, creating a second front that would force Rome to divide its forces. The physical reality of the Strait of Messina is treacherous. It is characterized by powerful, unpredictable currents known in mythology as the Charybdis. The rebels waited on the shore, their eyes fixed on the horizon for the distinctive sails of the pirate fleet. The gold was prepared, chests filled with Roman denarii, stolen senatorial jewelry, and raw bullion seized from the villas of Campania. The sound of the waves crashing against the jagged rocks of the strait was the only response they received. The pirates, having taken the payment in advance, never arrived. Whether they were bribed by Crassus or simply decided the risk of facing the Roman classis, navy, was too great, the result was a total logistical betrayal. The consequences for the rebel army were catastrophic. They were now stranded on the beach, with no way across the water and Crassus's wall closing in behind them. The escape to Sicily had become a death trap. In a fit of desperate, improvised engineering, the rebels attempted to build their own rafts. They used timber from local groves and tied together empty wine barrels with leather thongs. They tried to cross the churning water, but the Roman navy, patrolling the straits with heavy, bronze-sheathed quinquiremes, easily intercepted them. The Roman ships utilized their rams to smash the flimsy rafts into splinters. The sight of the rebels drowning in the cold Salt water was a grim testament to the failure of their maritime logistics. This betrayal marked the definitive turning point. The rebel army was no longer a unified, hopeful force. It was a collection of starving, desperate bands. The gold was gone. The sea was a barrier rather than a highway, and the Roman legions were tightening the noose. Spartacus was forced to turn back and face Crassus in the open field, but he was doing so with a fraction of his former strength. The sense of being hunted became a physical weight on every man in the rebel camp. They moved north, back toward the interior, but they were no longer the conquerors of the Apennines. They were a wounded animal, and Crassus was the patient hunter, closing the circle with every march. The breakout from the Bruttium Peninsula was a masterpiece of desperate military physics. Spartacus waited for a night of extreme weather, a heavy blizzard accompanied by freezing gales. The Roman sentries, huddled in their heavy wool sagum cloaks, struggled to see more than a few feet beyond the palisade. The rebels moved in absolute silence, forgoing torches. They utilized the bodies of their own dead and the carcasses of their mules to fill the deep Roman trench, creating a bridge of frozen flesh and bone. The sound of thousands of feet pounding over this makeshift path was muffled by the falling snow. They hit the Roman line at a section where the wall was still under repair. The combat was chaotic, visceral, and fought at such close quarters that shields were often useless. In the dark, friend was indistinguishable from foe except by the specific shape of the helmet. The rebels utilized their gladiatorial training, short, lethal stabs to the groin, neck, and inner thigh. The Roman line, thinned by the weather, buckled under the sheer pressure of the breakout. A significant portion of the rebel army spilled through the gap and into the open countryside of Lucania. But they had left behind their heavy equipment, their remaining baggage, and thousands of their comrades who were too weak to make the charge. Crassus was infuriated. He realized that if Spartacus managed to escape into the northern mountains again, the war could drag on for years, potentially allowing Pompey to arrive and claim the credit. He sent an urgent message to the Senate, requesting that Pompey the Great be recalled from Spain and Lucullus from the east. This was a massive political risk for Crassus. He desperately wanted the glory of ending the revolt for himself. The Roman pursuit now became a race against time and geography. The legions moved with a renewed, frantic intensity, shedding their heavy baggage and marching through the night to close the distance. The rebel army began to fragment again under the pressure. The internal ethnic tensions reached a violent breaking point. A large contingent of Gauls and Germans, led by Gannicus and Castus, separated from Spartacus, believing they could defeat the Romans in a separate engagement. They established a camp near the Lacanian lake. This splintering was the virus, finally succumbing to the antibiotics of Roman persistence. Crassus targeted this splinter group first. He used his cavalry to pin them against the water, and then his heavy infantry moved in for the kill. The water of the lake turned a deep, visceral red with the blood of 12,000 rebels. Only the sudden, desperate arrival of Spartacus's main force prevented a total massacre, but the damage was irreversible. The rebel strength had been halved in a single afternoon. The defeat of the splinter group under Gannicus and Castus highlighted the fundamental mechanical flaw in the rebel army, the lack of a unified political objective. While Spartacus seemed focused on military survival and an eventual exit from Italy, many of his followers were motivated by immediate plunder and localized revenge. This friction created a physical divide in their march formations. At the Battle of Camelatrum, Crassus's forces finally caught the remnants of the Gaulish and Germanic contingent. The Roman pilum, the heavy, specialized javelin, played a decisive role. When thrown, the soft iron neck of the pilum was designed to bend upon impact. If it lodged in a shield, it became a heavy, dangling weight that could not be easily removed, rendering the shield useless. The rebels were forced to discard their primary means of defense, leaving them exposed to the Roman gladius. The sound of the battle was the rhythmic clack of wood on wood, followed by the wet thud of the short sword finding a home in unarmored flesh. Crassus's legions moved like a wall of iron, utilizing the scutum to push the rebels back, then stabbing from behind the protection of the shield. It was an industrial process of killing, focused on efficiency rather than flair. Over 12,000 rebels fell in this single engagement. When the Romans inspected the bodies, only 2 were found with wounds in their backs. The rest had died facing the enemy. This spoke to the physical courage of the gladiators, even as their tactical situation collapsed. Spartacus was now leading a ghost of an army. They were being pursued through the mountains of Lucania, their physical condition deteriorating by the hour. They had no supply lines, living on roots, bark, and stolen grain. Their leather armor was rotting from the damp mountain air, and their swords were notched and dull from constant use. Yet, Spartacus remained a lethal threat. He managed to ambush and defeat a portion of Crassus's vanguard, proving that his tactical mind was still sharp. He knew the end was coming. He moved toward the Salaris River, choosing his final battlefield with the care of a man who was preparing for his own execution. Crassus, meanwhile, received word that Pompey had landed in Italy. Pompey was already being hailed by the public as the savior of the Republic. If Crassus did not finish the war immediately, the glory would be snatched away. This political pressure accelerated the military timeline. Crassus pushed his men to their physical limits, marching them through the night. The 2 armies were now like 2 exhausted boxers in the final round of a heavyweight fight, moving toward a collision that would decide the fate of the Roman Republic. The air near the Salaris was thick with the smell of wood smoke and the tension of 80,000 men preparing for a final, violent resolution. The Battle of the Salaris River in 71 B.C. was the final mechanical resolution of the Third Servile War. Spartacus drew up his remaining forces, roughly 30,000 men, in a traditional, desperate battle line. Before the engagement began, Spartacus performed a final, symbolic act that underscored the physical reality of his situation. He killed his own horse in front of his troops. He declared that if he won, he would have many horses to choose from. If he lost, he would not need one. This was a total commitment to a final stand. The rebels were arrayed against Crassus's 8 legions, which were deployed in a deep, reinforced triplex aces formation. The battle began not with a charge, but with a massive barrage of Roman pila. Thousands of iron-tipped spears arched through the sky, creating a sound like a sudden, violent rainstorm. The rebel front rank was decimated before the lines even met. Then, the 2 masses of men collided with a force that could be heard for miles. The sound was a deafening roar of bronze on iron, the screams of the dying, and the rhythmic chanting of the legions. Spartacus led a desperate, concentrated charge directly toward Crassus, hoping to end the war by killing the Roman commander in personal combat. He cut his way through the Roman ranks with the skill of the arena, killing 2 centurions. But the Roman formation was built to absorb such shocks. As the first Roman line tired or buckled, the second and third lines moved through the gaps to provide fresh, rested reinforcements. The rebels had no such luxury. They were a single, thinning line of exhausted men. Spartacus was eventually surrounded. He was struck in the thigh by a Roman spear, but he continued to fight on his knees, using his shield to ward off blows until he was finally overwhelmed and hacked to pieces by the legionaries. His body was so badly mutilated that it was never identified in the aftermath. The rebel formation collapsed into total chaos. The Roman cavalry, which had been held in reserve, was unleashed to cut down the fleeing survivors. The slaughter continued for hours, the banks of the Salaris River becoming choked with the bodies of the fallen. The Roman loss was minimal, approximately 1,000 men, while the rebel army was effectively erased from the physical world. The virus had been purged by the sheer physical weight and disciplined violence of the Roman military machine. The war was over, but the physical manifestation of Roman order was only beginning its final, horrific stage. The victory at the Salaris River was not enough for Crassus. He required a permanent, physical monument to his dominance. He had captured 6,000 rebels alive during the collapse of the army. These men were not sold back into the slave markets. They were used as the components of a massive psychological operation. From Capua, where the revolt began, to the gates of Rome, along the Appian Way, the Queen of Roads, Crassus ordered 6,000 crosses to be erected. Every few yards for nearly 120 miles, a man was nailed or tied to a wooden timber. The process of crucifixion is a slow, mechanical death by asphyxiation and exposure. The sound of 6,000 men moaning in agony filled the Italian countryside for days, a low, constant drone of human suffering. The smell of death and sun-scorched flesh hung over the most heavily traveled road in the Republic. Every merchant, traveler, and politician journeying to the capital was forced to walk through a corridor of dying men. This was not justice in a modern sense. It was a ritualized reclaiming of property and a demonstration of the state's absolute power over the human body. The bodies were left on the crosses to rot and be picked clean by birds of prey. The skeletal remains served as permanent, weather-beaten markers of the war's end. The iron nails and the gray, weathered wood of the crosses became a part of the permanent landscape of the Appian Way. A road that had once been a symbol of Roman engineering and connectivity was now a 120-mile graveyard. The physical power of the state had been demonstrated through the total and public destruction of its enemies' bodies. In Rome, the mood was one of grim relief. The slave virus had been contained, but the agricultural economy of southern Italy was in ruins. The physical scars of the war, the burnt villas, the fallow fields, and the thousands of crosses, would take a generation to fade. Crassus had achieved his victory, but he had done so with a level of brutality that shocked even his hardened contemporaries. The mechanics of the Third Servile War had proven that while Rome could be bled, its capacity for organized, state-sponsored violence was effectively limitless. The war ended not with a triumph for Crassus, but with a bitter political snub. Pompey the Great, returning from Spain, intercepted a few thousand fleeing rebels in the north and immediately wrote to the Senate. He claimed that while Crassus had defeated the slaves in battle, he, Pompey, had plucked the war up by the roots. Crassus was granted only an ovatio, a lesser victory parade where he wore a crown of myrtle, while Pompey was granted a full triumph. The physical frustration of Crassus was palpable. He had funded the war, reintroduced decimation, and built the wall, only to have the glory seized by a younger rival. This friction between Crassus and Pompey became the primary catalyst for the death of the Roman Republic. To bypass the Senate and secure their own power, the two generals joined forces with a rising political star, Julius Caesar, to form the First Triumvirate. This was the transformation of the Republic into a military autocracy. The legions were no longer loyal to the Senatus Populusque Romanus. They were loyal to the individuals who paid their wages and secured their land grants. The mechanics of power had moved permanently from the forum to the army camp. The rebellion of Spartacus, while physically crushed, fundamentally changed the way Rome managed its slave population. There was a gradual shift away from the brutal, factory-like latifundious system toward colonnatus, a system where laborers had more ties to the land and slightly more legal protection. This was not born of humanity, but of a pragmatic, mechanical need to prevent another internal collapse. The virus had forced the host to adapt its internal structures to survive. Ultimately, the story of Spartacus versus the Roman Empire is a story of physical systems in violent conflict. It is the story of the specialized killer of the arena versus the industrial, mass-produced soldier of the legion. It is the story of how a republic, built on the labor of the conquered, nearly choked on its own intake. As Rome transitioned into an empire, the memory of the Thracian who broke the grip of Capua remained a shadow in the mind of every commander. The war was over, but the era of the military strongman and the eventual collapse of the Republic had truly begun.